How did you meet Bernie McGann, man?
I met Bernie because he'd come to Bundeena one day and loved the place, and he moved here. And I met him, oh gee, I don't know how we met. I think her son played soccer, and he was much younger than me, and I was in the all age, so they sort of knew me through the football club and that, and I got to know him. But I think I knew him before then. I'm not sure how I got to know him, but that's right. We used to have concerts up at the BMA Hall, Bundeena, and he'd bring his band in. You know, he couldn't play jazz because jazz wasn't that big in Australia, so he played in a rock and roll band that had pipe sections and that in the band. You know, there was in the old days, the rock and roll, you could see the rock and roll changing from jazz to rock and roll. And a lot of jazz musicians were playing rock and roll in them days because there was no work for jazz. So Bernie was in a rock and roll band, even though he was a jazz player. He introduced me to Led Zeppelin, Bernie. He was the first guy to give me a Led Zeppelin album. But so I used to go and watch them play up at the BMA Hall, and I got to talk to him, and he was a local, and he used to, like Terry, my school teacher who was older than me. They were both about 13 years older than me. They both sort of thought I was a bit of a character, you know, like a bit of a rebel, and not many kids, they didn't know many kids my age that were like me in that time. You know, there was some rebel kids, but there wasn't kids like me who you know, would sit down and ask questions about living and life and all these sort of things. And, you know, it just wasn't just normal talk. I'd really want to know things, you know, about life and that. And
How did Bernie McGann help open your perceptions, dude?
a guy called Bernie McGann, who was a great saxophone player. He's a very famous, probably the best in Australia that's ever been, so they say, a jazz musician, Bernie McGann. He used to give guys that used to come around that were off their heads, and he lived at Bundeena, and he knew a lot of city guys from music and that, and some of them would lose it a bit. And he'd bring them back to Bundeena, and he'd introduce them to stuff like Maya Barber and people like that. But he said, no, Krishnamurti's for you. He said, he really thought that I could comprehend what Krishnamurti was saying, you know, more than Maya Barber or any of them blokes that you follow. Krishnamurti's different. He says you've got to understand yourself to know life. He doesn't say follow me, be me, do this, do that. You know, he doesn't give you the answers. He gives you the questions, and that's what the difference was for me for him. And the guy that gave it to me was so right. He was so right. He gave it to me at 16, and I read it for a long time. And what I didn't learn was that they talked about enlightenment and how good it felt, and what it did for you, and to be it immortal or whatever it is, because I don't know. I'm mortal, so I don't know immortality. But the thing is, what they were saying and what they were talking about was so different from what everyone else was talking about, and how everyone else lived, and how war was, and it was beyond another consciousness, you know. It was beyond another realm of thinking. It was really, really, it was intriguing. I was intrigued by it, you know. I wanted to know so much when I was young. But yeah, Bernie McGann was the first one to give me Krishnamurti, and I read Krishnamurti for a long time, off and on. And the thing about it was that made me realise after all these years that the feeling that I was chasing is a form of greed. You've got to want to know just for the sake of knowing. You can't want to know because you're going to gain something. It brings you back down to where you started, through greed, wanting. So you've got to want to know for the sake of wanting to know without getting any reward, which is really hard. But that's what learning is. If you want, the only time you get a reward is when you're not looking for one.
It's me, Johnny. I'm home.